As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
I actually think a mismatched couple at Tightwads and Spenthrifts is the greatest potential for happiness, but you have to do it the right way. And on average, a lot of couples kind of don't seem to be doing it the right way. So that can be quite explosive, the differences. Two spendthrifts can also be dangerous unless they have like tons of money to kind of buffer their habits.
That was Scott Rick on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey everyone, I'm here with Michael to introduce today's episode where I interview Scott Rick on his book called Tightwads and Spenthrifts, Navigating the Money Minefield in Real Relationships. And I think money is such a fascinating topic, especially in the context of relationships. So what were your thoughts on the episode, Michael?
So I thought it was really interesting. And I have to say that just because of the title of the book, I had a misunderstanding of what was coming my way, at least to a certain point, because when I heard tightwad, I was thinking of someone who is just very frugal. And I thought, well, I have a couple of people like that in my own life, which will spend 2 hours on a phone hotline to get like 50 cents back. And so this is what to me was, this was my understanding of the tightwad. But he makes this distinction and says that tightwads are actually people that save money because it is anxiety provoking for them to spend.
Right.
I thought it was really interesting that it's not necessarily values-based or necessity-based, but it's avoiding this anxiety around it. So for those people in my family who shall remain unnamed, that I categorize as very, very money conscious to a point where it's almost obsessive. How do I, as an outsider, know if they're doing that because for them it's values based? They want to leave something behind for their children, and if it takes a lot of work to spend a couple of bucks, then they'll do it. Or are they doing it because they have this fear of spending unnecessary money, and it's like tied to anxiety? How can I, as the outsider, tell?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm guessing what Scott would say is that for someone to be classified as a tightwad, not only do they have anxiety about spending money, but they also are aware that they could or should be spending money when they're not. And then, likewise with the spendthrift, it's not just a person who spends willy-nilly and excessively. It's a person who spends a lot, but knows they're probably spending more than they should, and they feel anxious or uncomfortable about that. Or they feel anxious or uncomfortable about not spending, right? They have like FOMO. But it was my impression that they're aware of those tendencies. And so I think you could probably just ask them.
That's anxiety provoking.
Yeah, right. So you'd have to be able to tolerate your own anxiety about having a conversation about this person's behavior. But, the book is about navigating the money minefield in relationships. And that isn't necessarily just romantic relationships. It could be any other friendship or family relationship.
Yeah.
I want to know how that goes, Michael.
Yeah, no, I immediately regret asking you that question. Okay, just to totally deflect from my responsibility in that regard now, there was something else that I thought as I was listening to that interview, and that is I should have this discussion with your husband, because there's this anecdote you share in the interview that made me immediately go like, oh, wow, her husband is really cool. So I gotta meet him at one point.
You are fellow nerds, that is for sure.
Oh, yes. And but the reason you share this anecdote was in regards to a concept that the author talks about, and that's the difference between translucency and transparency when it comes to finances. So this was something that really stood out to me. And while you explained the difference between those two in the interview, I was wondering, what are some concrete steps that can be taken in a relationship to bring translucency about instead of transparency?
Yeah, it's funny you bring this up, because I was honestly just thinking about this yesterday. And I'll give another anecdote, because it was a situation where I wished that I had known about translucency and had been translucent instead of transparent. And so what Scott gets into this in the episode, but essentially it's being open about money, but not necessarily every detail, every penny, every purchase. And what he recommends is that you have joint bank accounts for certain things, but that you also have your own separate bank accounts with some amount of discretionary funds that you can spend on, your hobbies or other activities. And while your partner, you each know that you have this account, you've agreed about how much money will go in it. And then whatever you buy and however much it costs, that's the part that you're allowed to keep to yourself. And so I had, my husband buys comic books, and I don't quite understand the fascination, which is, of course, what you're referring to, that you think he's super cool. And then I tend to spend money on, manis and petties and facials and these kinds of things, which, of course, he does not really value in his own life. But there is this one it's really embarrassing to admit, but I essentially got suckered into buying a beauty product, like a skin light wand thing that was way more money than it should have been.
I have no idea what you're talking about at this point. By the way, I'm just siding with your husband here.
Exactly. So it's this, dumb infrared thing that's supposed to help my wrinkles. And I felt like I had to be totally honest about what happened and how much it cost. And of course, now he will not let me live it down. Not in a mean way. He doesn't really care that I spent the money. It's more like he teases me because I got suckered. And I will admit, I totally got suckered. But it was one of those things I'm like, darn it, if only I had met Scott and knew about translucency, I would have gotten away with buying this thing and I would still feel stupid. But at least I wouldn't be getting teased about it all the time. So does that answer your question? It may not, but.
Yes, absolutely. Now I kind of want to see a photo of that thing you bought, but that was a great example on both sides of power of translucency.
Well, there's a lot of good stuff in this episode about being a tightwad, being a spendthrift, or what he calls an unconflicted consumer, which you may be somewhere in the middle, but we've certainly, irrespective of where we fall on the spectrum, we certainly have many people in our lives that fall in different places on the spectrum. So I think you'll get a lot out of this interview with Scott Rick. Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I have Scott Rick here today to talk with us about money. Scott Rick is a marketing professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. He holds a PhD in behavioral decision research from Carnegie Mellon University, where he was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. He's published research in premier journals spanning marketing, psychology, economics, and neuroscience. At the University of Michigan, he has won awards for both research and teaching. Rick's research has been covered extensively in outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and NPR. His first book, Tightwads and Spendthrifts, Navigating the Money Minefield in Real Relationships, was published in January 2024 by St. Martin's Press, and it is what we are here to talk about today. So, Scott, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock. Thanks so much for being here.
Jill, I'm really excited. Thank you.
Good. Well, this is such a great topic. I love it when things that might seem like they're not obvious psychological topics cross over into the world of psychology. And as your bio said, I mean, this book is chock full of research in psychology, economics, neuroscience. So I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. And what I thought we could start with was, it's actually a quote from your introduction.
Okay.
Where you say, quote, our psychology not only influences how we handle money, but the way we handle money also influences our psychology. So this might be a big question to start with, but I thought maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes. You often hear people say when couples argue about money, it's just on the surface about money. It's actually about something, some pre-existing condition. And that can happen, of course. I agree. But what I'm trying to say there is that the way that we happen to handle money, whether it's very intentional or just kind of accidental, someone went to the bank one day and set up the accounts a certain way. But the way we manage money at home can create psychological dynamics that otherwise would not have been there and can bring partners closer together or further apart. They can reinforce messages about whose money is whose and, how much we value each other. And so, yeah, it goes both ways, I think.
Well, your subtitle specifically says navigating the money minefield. And I think that's what you're speaking to. It really can be a minefield, and the psychology really relates to how much of a minefield it is. So in the title of the book, you talk about tightwads and spendthrifts. So I think we certainly need to start there with some definitions. So how we handle money basically exists on this continuum from tightwad to spendthrift, with what you call unconflicted consumers in the middle. So can you define those three terms for us?
Yes. I focus on the extremes in the title because they're the most interesting. They get the fun names. So tightwads, the way we define it, these are people who they often look good on paper. You might not know based on their bank account balances that they would be nervous about spending money, but they experience a lot of distress and worry about optional purchases. They worry about going broke. They're very concerned for their future selves. It causes them to not buy a lot of things that they kind of recognize that they should buy and can't afford, and they often kick themselves for kind of not going through with it. And certainly the people around them can help to kick them also if they're making life difficult for the family. So they're hurting twice. It's kind of, there's distress before thinking about spending the money, and then you don't spend it, and then you kind of kick yourself for not spending it. So they're a little conflicted with this. There's different ways to spend conservatively. Like some people just love saving. They love reusing everything they could possibly reuse. We call them frugal people. Frugal people are very happy. That is not the tightwad approach. It's very different psychology.
So by definition, a tightwad is someone who is struggling with the fact that they have trouble spending money.
Exactly.
So they're not just cheap.
No.
They're not miserly. They're not frugal. I know that I could and should spend this money, but I have so anxiety about the prospect of kind of loss that I am a tightwad. I struggle to spend it. Ego dystonic rather than ego syntonic. Do you know these terms in psychology? The ego dystonic meaning I recognize that this is problematic and something that perhaps I'd like to change.
Yeah, they could not be identified as a tightwad on our measure without recognizing that this is kind of suboptimal and something I would like to change. And they tell us that. They may have moments of frugality or cheapness, but the overarching approach for a tightwad is just kind of this. It's like my wife. She's a tightwad. She used to come home from shopping, what she would call shopping, and tell me about the things that she wished she would have purchased. And I was like, next time, take me. I'll help you buy it.
So you're a spendthrift.
I am.
Okay, so what is a spendthrift and how is that
Yes.
different from a tightwad?
Yeah. So if tightwads are kind of driving around with the emergency brake on, driving around with someone who cut the brake line. So we are a little more present minded. We worry about missing out on experiences, and we don't want to regret not having bought something. And so we buy things just in case. I might go out shopping for work clothes and see a nice velvet blazer and think, oh, that would be fun for like a holiday party. I'm not invited to any holiday parties, but what if I was? I wouldn't want to be without it. So I'm going to buy it just in case. I listened to a podcast called Ask Rana, and she has some spendthrift tendencies. She says, I'd rather be looking at it than looking for it. And that's kind of the approach.
Okay.
Take.
Right. There's like a fear if I don't buy it now and I need it later, it will no longer be available to me. So
wouldn't that be a bummer? Yeah.
So in some ways, the tightwad and the spendthrift are both doing this like better to be safe than sorry mentality, but just one is doing it by not spending and the other one is doing it by maybe overspending. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So at their heart, there's a lot of similarities between these two extremes. And then, yes, in the middle, that's where a plurality of people are, the unconflicted consumers, and they, the breaks work well for them, not too little, not too much. And they're kind of at peace with what they're spending, and they tend to be happiest in our surveys. And, I wish them well. They're not the most interesting people, but that's a good place to be.
And so what does your research say, what proportion of us fall into these? I think what you just said is that the most of us are in the unconflicted consumer. So what proportion of people tend to be spendthrifts versus tightwads versus unconflicted?
Yeah. So averaging across all of our surveys, I'd say we usually find around 25% tightwad, 25% spendthrift, and then 50% in the middle. There's a good chance that in a relationship, you're going to have at least one extreme. And often if you have one, sometimes there's another one attached.
Okay. So we're going to talk about how these people come together and what happens when they do come together. But what do we know, again, from your research about who is more likely to be a tightwad or spendthrift? Are there differences in, age, gender, education level, and maybe most importantly, income?
Yeah. There's a very slight relationship with gender. It's a very small correlation, but it always shows up where women are a little more likely to be spendthrifts than men. If you look at kind of their educational background, at least those who went to college, tightwads are usually more likely to have opted into a mathematical major. They are a little more math oriented, and I think they're more money minded in general. It's just kind of something they obsess over, for better or worse. So the older generations tend to be a little more tightwad. We don't know if that's a cohort thing or if that's something that happens as you age, but just on average, older people are more tightwad. But yeah, I think tightwads are more kind of future-minded. Spendthrifts a little more impulsive and present-minded.
Right. You might have a tightwad who's afraid they're going to live so long they won't be able to afford their own care versus the spendthrifts are like, nobody wants to be the richest guy in the graveyard, right? You're going to say, what if you die and you could have spent all this money on these amazing experiences and things and you just wasted all these opportunities?
That's right. So yeah, I talk about my spendthrift hero in the book, Sammy Davis Jr., who, he took it a little too far, but he would talk about like, well, what is the point of having all this money? Do I just want to be kind of in a nursing home, kind of with a big stack of money, kind of just like not being able to function anymore, but look at the money. No, I want to live a life.
Enjoy it. Yeah. And what about the relationship? Because I imagine people would say, well, probably you're a tightwad or a spendthrift, depending on how much money you have. If you don't have a lot of money, you're going to be a tightwad. If you do, you're going to spend it. But that's actually not the case.
Yeah. We don't find that current income is a real good predictor of where you are on this measure. There might be moments where I was in grad school and had no money. I had to train myself to be a temporary tightwad just to survive. But, I quickly got back to my normal habits once I was no longer making nothing. But there are plenty of tightwads who make a wonderful income and have great savings, and plenty of spendthrifts who have very little income to speak of. And past income might be a better predictor, kind of income in the home during formative years. I think that's more likely to stick with you. But no, current income, it's not just, you're not a tightwad because you just can't afford to spend.
Right. Right. And is there anything else we know, besides maybe income growing up, about what predicts who is more likely to become a tightwad or a spendthrift?
Well, certainly, if your parents were spendthrifts, you're more likely to be a spendthrift. There's a relationship between parents and kids there. It might not emerge real early on. We don't see a relationship between parents and young kids, but between adult children and their parents, we do see a relationship. I think kids can only mimic so much. They have to become adults themselves to mimic some of the things they saw. A child can't mimic like a bad mortgage or buying a Tesla, but eventually we all come back home, it seems. But yeah, I would want to know also which parent they spent more time with, kind of watching and being around. But no, I think tightwads tend to be a little more neurotic, let's say, kind of anxious, worried. I think that lends itself to a tightwad orientation. So there are some clues here and there.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say kids end up mimicking their parents, because your research also shows that a tightwad is more likely to marry a spendthrift than a tightwad is to marry a tightwad, or a spendthrift is to marry a spendthrift. So if that's the case, then you have kids having one of each kind of modeling. So I would love to talk about that, like why you think this is, that a tightwad would be attracted to a spendthrift and vice versa.
Yes. And it's very strange because normally birds of a feather flock together. We tend to like people who resemble ourselves in all kinds of ways. And we tend to spend most of our time with people who are like ourselves. But the interesting thing about this piece of ourselves is that, as we discussed, the extremes are conflicted. The tightwads and spendthrifts, they don't love this aspect of themselves. Now, someone like me who's written about it, and I've very much come to peace with it, but on average, there are a lot of tightwads and spendthrifts who really don't like this about themselves. And when you don't love something about yourself and then you encounter someone who displays that same flaw, it can really highlight it and put a spotlight on it that you would have preferred not to think about right now. You might see someone doing or talking about money in the way that you do and just think, oh, is that how I appear to other people? Is that what I look like? And it could really be uncomfortable to be around. So we think at first that might be a little bit of a turnoff, and that it might be kind of interesting and exciting and funny to kind of be around someone who approaches money so differently. And it's kind of fascinating to be up close and watch this strange behavior. It might be quite charming at first. And you can imagine a tightwad being wowed by a spendthrift. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I would never do such a thing.
Right. Especially if they're spending money on them. If I'm a tightwad dating a spendthrift and it's fancy dinners and, doing these things I would never do for myself, I could see how exciting and almost like forbidden that would be, and where that attraction could come from.
Yes. Yeah. And, I think that's great and fun, certainly while dating. And usually the stakes are a little lower while dating. How many permanent decisions are you making? But, if you get married or get into something long-term, then, you have to start deciding about bigger things, houses and cars
and whether to share your money. Generally when you're dating, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, and never the two shall cross.
Yes.
Becomes more complicated when there's a question now, like you said, are we going to buy a home that we own together? Are we going to combine our finances? We're now, if I'm a tightwad and you're a spendthrift and you're spending money that I see as half mine, that's where a lot of that money minefield comes into play.
Yes. It's endlessly complicated. And I think in ways that people don't anticipate when they're just kind of in the early stages of dating and having fun. And one thing I would tell people is that when you're dating, if the way that they handle money is really irritating to you already, just know that it's probably not going to get better. It's probably going to get worse. So,
Right.
I never tell someone to avoid a partner because they're a tightwad or a spendthrift. But if, early on, if it's a red flag, that's just going to be like many, many more red flags on the way.
It'll be a much brighter red as you go.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you reported a finding where if you ask a single person who's a tightwad or a spendthrift who they think they would prefer to marry, a tightwad says a tightwad and a spendthrift says a spendthrift, but that's not actually how it plays out, right? I mean, we don't know ourselves as well as we'd like to think that we do.
Yeah. I don't think we realize, how we'll react to someone kind of in the wild and
Right.
actually see these things play out. But it is a very sensible intuition that, yeah, I would like someone like myself. And they say that on all kinds of dimensions. I want similarity. And normally similarity is good for well-being. But yes, just the initial impact can be surprising.
What are the most harmonious versus more conflictual pairings
Yeah.
among tightwads and spendthrifts?
Yeah. So, I mean, what we find is left to their own devices, a tightwad spendthrift pairing can be quite explosive. Those are the most likely to fight over money and be unhappy with the relationship, to say things like, I wish I would have just married someone else or stay single. And so I actually think a mismatched couple, a tightwad spendthrift, is the greatest potential for happiness. But you have to do it the right way. And on average, a lot of couples kind of don't seem to be doing it the right way. So that can be quite explosive, the differences. Two spendthrifts can also be dangerous unless they have like tons of money to kind of buffer their habits. So, having a lot of debt, that's a problem. And we see that. So those can be quite dangerous also. But at least they're not fighting as much. They might be in lots of debt, but they're both in it together.
Right.
That's actually a positive. And then two tightwads, they score highest on these measures of marital satisfaction from like the 50s, where it's like, if you both say, yeah, we both like to live a quiet life at home, like that gets you more points on the scale than if you say, oh, we like adventure and novelty and trying new things. So they score high on kind of quiet life measures, but I think there's some quiet desperation there among kind of two tightwad couples. There's a lot they're missing out on, and they're not going to, flame out financially, but there's a lot of life they're missing out on.
Yeah. There may be, I wonder if there would be more end of life regret over,
Yeah.
all of the saving we did, and that felt safe and in control, but maybe we missed out on a bigger existence.
Very possible.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's pluses and minuses of all of the different types of pairings.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and humans are complicated, so I suppose that's not a huge surprise.
Exactly.
What I found really interesting is your research found in general, of course, there are exceptions to this, but in general, that couples, I'm assuming married couples, or at least, long-term committed couples who have joint bank accounts report higher marital satisfaction than those with separate accounts. And also those with joint accounts have fewer financial problems. And he said this is partly because it's reflective of having a more communal orientation inside the relationship as opposed to like keeping score.
Yes.
And it's also partly because there's a greater financial transparency, right? But then you also say that full 100% financial transparency is not necessarily optimal, and you recommend more of a translucency. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a complicated argument because I am a big fan of joint accounts. I think they do a lot of important work. I think they make your money and my money into our money, and they can reduce that scorekeeping, which is very important in a relationship. You want to stave that off as long as you can. And relationships don't start that way, but they can get into scorekeeping. But you're better off the longer you can stay away from that. But I don't love only joint accounts. I do love this kind of combination of accounts where we each take some of our money, but we get to spend it without the other person kind of closely inspecting what we're up to. And that's what I'm talking about with this idea of financial translucency. So you want kind of a high level understanding of what everyone's doing every week or month. Like, oh, I see what we're each taking out of the shared account, but the details are just kind of available upon request. And hopefully the requests are kind of few and far between. That there's some trust there because we might have different interests, different hobbies or passions or consumption habits, and we need those to be happy. But our partner might not understand, and they might criticize us for our latte habit or an expensive hobby. But if it's not jeopardizing the joint account, the household, then you don't need to know all these little details. Just trust that I'm keeping it within like a number that we both know. So I have found this to be kind of a particularly counterintuitive suggestion. Like people love the idea of transparency and like 100% hide nothing from your partner. But I mean, I don't know. Can we not have diaries? Do we have to say everything that comes into our mind? Like,
God forbid.
If I think, oh, hey, honey, doesn't our neighbor look really attractive today? Can I just keep that to myself, or do I have to blurt out every little thing? So I think some individuality is important, even in a committed relationship.
It makes so much sense. And this was really striking to me because, I think about, of course, in my own relationship, my husband is obsessed with comic books and we have joint accounts, and I'm not generally checking and looking. And there was this day that I had to look something up on our credit card bill because I wasn't sure I'd gotten reimbursed from something that was supposed to come back. And all of a sudden I saw all these charges for his comic books. And Scott, I swear I started to panic because I thought, oh my God, does he have a problem? Is this an obsession? Almost like you've discovered a gambling addiction.
Yeah.
It really worried me. And, it turns out these comic books are not actually very expensive. It just looked like a lot of different charges, and it all ended up being fine. But it really struck me in your book that it's hard for me to understand the desire to spend money on something like a comic book simply because it is not something I happen to value in my own life. But what we often joke about is, if you look at who's spending more money, it's definitely me spending more money.
Uh-huh.
But it's on, for him, it's like he doesn't understand hair color and manicures or, whatever it is, the things that I'm spending money on. And even though we don't actually have our own kind of separate accounts, but it did lead us to this place of we're going to trust. We know what bills need to be paid and we know how much money we have coming in, and we're going to trust that, we can spend on ourselves and don't need to be questioning each other about it because we just understand that what is important to us or what we want to spend money on, they're just two totally different things. And it is a place that I've seen conflict in other couples that I know, especially if there's one who's bringing in more money than the other. That it's kind of this mentality of what I'm spending money on is okay, but what you're spending money on is not okay. And there's that failure to recognize that just because I think this is important doesn't mean the other person thinks it's important, and vice versa.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, you bring up so much there that's so important. First, I should say, there's different ways to do it. For example, we might both have our own credit cards that we pay out of the joint account. And I see that you paid X dollars per month. So I know the number you spend. I just don't need to look at your statement. And you could do this many ways. But it sounds like your husband and I might have, if we lived in the same city, we might bump into each other at the same stores. I go to a shop that has baseball cards and comics and that kind of thing. And again, my wife, I'm not jeopardizing anything. She doesn't need to know the details, but there's a trust there.
And I like in the chapter you say it's about connecting rather than protecting. And
That's right.
that really made sense to me when you're talking about trust and relationships.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
I
So
love that.
I think translucency is a way to, um, again, maintain this balance between individuality and kind of a shared relationship. And yeah, connecting and protecting. It's hard to do both at the same time. The things you do to protect yourself in the event that your partner misbehaves or the marriage breaks down, those actions will, in general, prevent you from connecting with them. So
Right.
it's just this trade-off that you have to make. And yeah, transparency, that's good for, like, my university, keeping track of how I spend my university credit card and I have to send in receipts. That's a work thing. That's when you need transparency, or when you're dealing with a stranger, but it's not for like a long-term committed
Right.
relationship.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. It is sort of a novel idea. When I first was reading about it, I was like, "Oh, this seems different." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that makes so much sense. I love it. So
Yeah.
great." So you have some suggestions because going back to this definition, tightwads are not just cheap, right? It's
Yeah.
somebody who is less likely to spend money, but has some anxiety about the fact that they're not spending money. And the spendthrifts are spending money, but have some anxiety that maybe they're overspending and they know they shouldn't be. So if a tightwad or a spendthrift wanted to get more comfortable and be less anxious around their spending or lack thereof, what are some of your recommendations?
Yes. So the tightwad, um, it's the common behavioral science thing of knowing yourself, committing to a future version of yourself in advance, because your future self might, misbehave a little bit. So you have to pre-commit. And so for a tightwad, what that can look like is, we normally think about budgeting to help people control their spending, but a tightwad needs budgeting to loosen up. They need to earmark or set aside money that is for optional, unplanned, fun purchases. And so that money is there in advance. When they encounter something um, that is kind of, fun and they hadn't considered before, because otherwise they would not be able to justify that purchase in the moment.
In the moment,
Um,
right?
so if that money is there, though, waiting for them, already earmarked, then that can loosen them up a little bit.
You think it would make sense, like, so in kind of creating that budget, would it make sense to kind of sit down and have a conversation about like what really matters to you? Like what, on this podcast, we talk so much about values, like what you want to stand for
Yeah.
and what matters and what you want your life to look like. Because I can imagine, for some people that might be experiences over material possessions, for example. And like maybe it's fine to be a tightwad if you're talking about like buying a Tesla, you gave us an example before. Or maybe you want to spend more money on an electric vehicle because climate change is really important to you. So like, would that make sense to sort of like, let's talk about your values, not you have to have a budget for fun because maybe this person doesn't really care about fun.
Yes.
Or maybe they do. Or maybe it's a budget for travel because your family lives far away and it matters to you to see your family. Would that make it easier to kind of like would that ease their anxiety because it's kind of connecting to something that matters to them, not just frivolously spending money?
Yeah. So I would say a budget for things you value but see as kind of non-necessities. So that could be fun. That could be, environmental minded spending. It could be all kinds of things. But yeah, it is good to talk with someone, a spouse or a therapist or someone that can bring perspective to help you understand what it is you'd want to earmark for. And so it does take some work, some exploration. That later in the book I say you need to explore your partner's inner psychological worlds for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, you need to explore your own too.
Yeah. And then, so what about for a spendthrift? How do we have them pull back?
Yeah. So budgeting for like short time periods, like I have a budget per week instead of per month, that can really force you to weigh opportunity cost. What am I giving up by purchasing this now? And, like in my time in grad school, when I had to force myself to become a tightwad, I would create all kinds of psychological speed bumps to spending. I would try to pay in cash as much as possible. And I would experience pain at the ATM when taking out the money because I knew my balance very closely. So that was painful. And then I would have pain when spending the cash at the store. And so I was putting up all these moments to kind of reconsider, like, do I really need this? And if I had to pay by card, I would take the receipt and go home and enter it into an Excel file. Like, oh, I just spent $15 at Walgreens, even though it would already come up on my report automatically. I needed to feel it. I needed to watch the balance go down.
Yeah, it's way too easy when you're paying with a card or something that symbolizes money but isn't really money to go, oh, it's just $15. But if you, oh, it's just $15 every day, that can add up pretty quickly and you don't realize it. I know every single time my credit card bill comes in, I'm like, how could it possibly be this much? I just paid the whole thing up.
Yes.
Because it's just sort of out of awareness what we're spending on when it's on these plastic cards.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and for a spendthrift, nobody in the retail space is looking to help you.
Right.
So they're looking to make spending as invisible and frictionless as possible. So Disney, you pay with a little wristband, you tap that, and think about the Amazon stores where you just walk out. There is no checkout. They just kind of have people watching you and they kind of total up what you're carrying. And they want to make it totally invisible. So,
and all the online shopping, my credit card number just fills in by itself. It's just in there, I don't even have to walk downstairs and get my wallet and look at my card number and type it all in.
Exactly. So you have to go in and delete your card and don't save this. And now, unfortunately, as a spendthrift, I have all my credit card information memorized. My wife always thinks it's like a magic trick, but just kind of find ways to slow yourself down and reconsider.
Well, we just unexpectedly ended up buying a lake house property that was not really part of the plan. It was part of the long-term plan, but it was kind of one of these opportunities that sort of fell in our lap that my whole family agreed like we would be crazy not to jump on this. And it definitely it's going to require some belt tightening. So I was reading this book at just the right time, even though I don't necessarily consider myself a spendthrift, but I'm fairly comfortable spending money. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to use some of these strategies that Scott talks about in his book to make it a little harder to spend money while we get used to this new expense that we're very, very excited about and feeling a tad bit anxious about at the same time. So I was appreciative to have some of those strategies because they all made so much sense. Like it's common sense, but just things I'd never really thought about before.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm right there with you. Our version of that is we just remodeled, added a bedroom. And so I'm trying to, bring a few speed bumps back into my own life.
Right. Yeah. When there are these big expenses that, it feels a little more intimidating to figure that out over a slightly longer period of time maybe than usual. Well, let's talk. You have a whole chapter on parenting.
Yeah.
And a couple highlights are, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, but the kids really do what they see us do, not what we tell them to do.
Yeah.
And if there are disagreements, so if you have parents who one is a tightwad, one is a spendthrift, and the parents disagree on how money should be spent, like on the children, you recommend deferring to the tightwad when the decision is about spending on material possessions, like toys, but deferring to the spendthrift when deciding on experiences that might be meaningful, like vacations. So I thought that was really interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah. So that's kind of based on research about kind of what brings lasting happiness. And, this is hard as a spendthrift and someone who collects baseball cards to say, hit the brakes on the material purchases. But there is plenty of research showing that there's a lot of material things that might bring an immediate burst of joy, but kind of we get tired of pretty quickly and adapt to.
Well, and as parents, we've all seen that, right? The Christmas or birthday or whatever, and the kids just have loads of toys. And you actually talk about a study that looks at this, that like when there's more to choose from, they tend to play less. Right.
Wild?
So there's that issue of excess, but also just the kid who'd rather play with the box than the toy, or is so excited about the toy, it's all they ever wanted. And then, they're tired of it within 5 minutes and it goes in a corner and never gets played with again.
Exactly. So yes, that is one place to defer to the tightwad, I think, when there's a disagreement. But I am so convinced by the research on experiences and what families can get out of novel shared experiences, that's where I say maybe let the spendthrift be in charge of some of the vacation planning. And because it's not just the fun or interesting experience itself, it's the anticipating it, it's the remembering it, the telling stories. And I think you really learn a lot about each other when you're doing new, unusual things, more so than kind of in the day to day and, just going about your routine. And you can really learn a lot about your people in your family when you're pushing yourselves and doing new, interesting things. So that's where I say let the spendthrift take control. And certainly on shared vacations with my family, there are things that, there's some trust. I don't necessarily report to my wife exactly what everything costs. Hopefully she doesn't ask. If she does, maybe I just quote the number before tax. And, we don't need to get into all the nitty gritty here, but yeah, these are important.
Yeah. Do you have any advice about how to talk to kids? I mean, because of course they're going to do what they see us do. And it feels still important that we be talking to them about money and finance and responsibility. And so what I think about, for example, is we have a 10-year-old son who, this will come as no surprise to anyone else out there who has a kid around this age. He wants to spend every penny he makes on V-Bucks and Fortnite. And this worries my husband and me. And I understood this from reading your book, that okay, part of this is that this is his hobby and I may not understand how important this is to him because it's not important to me. I don't value V-Bucks the way he does. But it also means that he never has money in his bank account. So for example, if it's his sister's birthday, and they're getting to the age that I want them to be thoughtful and to think about a gift and to pick out a gift and pay for part of that gift, but he's constantly just spending the money on himself to do this thing. And, we want to try to instill a desire to save for what he might need later, just to have a little bit better balance. And I'm not sure if we should bother, or if we should bother, what kinds of things we should be saying to him.
Yes, I'm with you. 11-year-old Minecraft, same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's, value in letting them make mistakes, as I think it's okay to have an emergency break that you get to pull as a parent. You can spend up to some amount at a time on this thing that I don't understand, but you care about. I like talking them through trade-offs. I cannot completely turn off my spendthrift ways. I try to do that a little more around them. But, I might say that, yeah, maybe we can do this thing that you really want to do, but it means that we won't do this other thing that you also want to do. And you might be a little sad about that later. So I want you to go in knowing what you're forgoing later.
I'll have to make sure that's something he cares about, because if I say you won't have any money to buy your sister a birthday present, he will not care at all. I'll be like, I don't care. That's fine. So I'll have to find something that he would actually feel like he'd be missing out on if he didn't have the money to spend on it.
Yeah, some of it does start to feel like hostage negotiation.
Right.
But for us, it's like, oh, you want to go to this Detroit Tigers game? Well, then I know you also wanted to go bowling and play the arcade there. And so maybe we don't get to do that. Is that, are we comfortable with this? Would we rather wait? So just kind of helping them think through these things. And then I also realized that young children did not fully understand what a credit card meant and what it meant to kind of pull that out at Target. And that just seemed like to be the free item card, and
right.
Helping them understand what that's attached to. And because how else would they know? I mean,
yeah, that's right. They wouldn't. Yeah, when we were growing up, if we asked my dad, oh, how much did that cost? His answer, even now, his answer is a couple of bucks. And, it's sort of a funny joke in our family, a couple of bucks. And now we do it to each other and to our kids. But I realized that's not really teaching them that you have to work really hard for a long time to make this amount of money to be able to have this thing. Because it's really not just a couple of bucks. And that it might actually be a better strategy to be a little bit more open and honest about how much things cost.
Yeah. And, that's something my wife and I wrestle with, kind of what do we reveal about income and cost and,
Right.
because they go to Target, they'll see kind of signs like, up to $20 an hour. And they'll think, well, that's rich. I mean, that's, they need some context.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been educating them about property taxes lately. And it's fun to watch.
They must love that.
Yes. Yes. But no, the fact that they kind of mimic much more than they follow verbal advice it took me a while to learn that. But the research on this is so clear that if dad says, hey, you got to wear your sunscreen, it's super important, but he doesn't wear his sunscreen, they're going to think it's not important. Maybe you can coerce them into it, but when they have to make a decision about should they put it on themselves, they're not. They're just not. And so it's been an education for me.
Yeah. And it's almost more like it's less about let me teach you the way you should be making these decisions, but maybe being a little more verbal about the way their dad and I are making decisions, because that's the piece they're going to end up mimicking down the road. But if we're doing all of our financial stuff behind closed doors and being secretive and not, they have no idea how much we make or how much we spend or how we make those decisions.
Yes. So it's like in psychology and experience, we say like the talk aloud protocol. It's like a talk aloud decision making. And
totally.
Yes, because otherwise it's just so inscrutable to them.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Last question for our single listeners. Yeah. If they want to marry someday, you know what I'm going to ask you.
Oh, I do.
Should they marry for love or money?
Yes. Marrying for money is basically impossible, I think. It's like winning the lottery. You can't do it. It's not practical because people who have money marry other people who have money. And even if you do marry someone with tons of money, are they like super eager to share it with you and say, oh yeah, let's divide this equally? Probably not. So I think it's kind of not a great idea to aim to marry for money. So you might think, oh, he's proposing marry for love. But yes, love is essential, obviously. But you can love all kinds of people that you just can't mesh with and live a great life with. You might fall in love with someone who has a totally different idea about how many kids they want or what kind of urban versus suburban versus rural setting they want to live in. And sometimes you have to say goodbye to people you love just because that life would not work out for the two of you. And so that's why I say you've got to marry for well-being. You've got to, you need enough money, you need enough love, but you also need enough kind of psychological and lifestyle similarity, kind of similar values and interests and things to talk about. And so it's a high bar I'm proposing. Like you need all of these things, but you really do. A deficit in any one can be kind of a recipe for a really unhappy life. And so, dating, by all means, explore, try out different things, but to commit that way, you really need all these pieces in place.
All right. You heard it here first. The answer to whether you should marry for love or money. Well, Scott, it was so great to have you. If our listeners want to find out more about you, what's the best place that they can find you?
Yeah. Well, my website, scottrick.com, has info about the book and the research it's based on. I'm on all the socials. Recently got on Instagram. I'm at Likely Shopping. I was happy that handle was still available. But
that's awesome.
Yeah. Feel free to get in touch. I'm around.
I love it. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.